characters of the TV show The Big Bang Theory and how they stealthily contribute to the continuation of hegemonic masculinity. Of course, in order to move forward, we'll need a couple of definitions. So, first of all, Connell describes hegemonic masculinity as a prevalent ideology which maintains, legitimates, and naturalizes the interests of powerful men over the interests of others, notably women and gay men. Kiesling adds to this that hegemonic masculinity is an ideology based on a hierarchy of dominant alignment roles, especially men over women, but also men over other men. So if all of this is true, we have to consider what it means to be a powerful man. How does one perform a version of masculinity which is legible and which grants one access to social power? The answer seems to be stringent adherence to a set of core tenets of masculinity: achievement, heterosexuality, emotional restraint, and cross-gender dominance. Adherence to these rules dictates the placement of men within a continuously constructed intra-gender hierarchy, which operates simultaneously with the inter-gender hierarchy asserted by the hegemony. In this way, when powerful men subordinate non-male gender identities, they also subordinate less powerful men who also subordinate non-male gender identities. The prevalence of hegemonic masculinity therefore limits male expressions to those which adhere to its tenets, relegating male speakers of non-adherent varieties to what Lakoff calls a kind of unmaleness. So therefore, the hegemony creates a space on the intra-gender hierarchy in which less dominant men, such as the principal characters on the TV show The Big Bang Theory, are allowed to perform a kind of stealth masculinity. They go unnoticed in their status-grabbing misogyny and homophobia, and forming an insidiously illegible performance of the hegemony by subordinate men in the real world. The Big Bang Theory is a television show which centers around 4 young, maladapted male scientists. They're all incredibly intelligent and successful in their fields, but unsuccessful on all social avenues. They're small, nerdy, and uncharismatic, and have little to no romantic experience. Their existence as subordinate men is, in many ways, the focal point of the show. In fact, a lot of the jokes and plots don't make sense with more legible forms of masculinity. For example, in Season 1, Episode 1, Sheldon and Leonard meet their neighbor Penny, someone who's established immediately as being a young and attractive woman. They immediately agree to help her in a favor she asks, which is retrieving a TV from her ex-boyfriend's house. However, upon arriving at this guy's house, Leonard finds himself face-to-face with a much larger, towering man who goes a step beyond denying him the TV and takes his pants in the process. There's an argument to be made that this is actually helpful to the construction of some more inclusive definition of masculinity, but if we take a step back, we can see what's actually going on here, which is that this is the first episode of the show for a reason. It orients the viewer to seeing these characters as something less than real men, and therefore when they are openly homophobic or misogynistic, their lack of legible access to social power insulates them from consequence. Still, so far I've only shown that they're good neighbors, and therefore I'll establish a parallel of patterns between behaviors of men in the real world and the characters on The Big Bang Theory as they interact with the core tenets of hegemonic masculinity. Because hegemonic masculinity relies largely on comparative dominance and the subordination of others, it requires a certain amount of self-promotion as well. Jennifer Coates establishes patterns of expressions of achievement in same-gender groups of men in her essay, Pushing at the Boundaries, Expressions of Alternative Masculinities. Perhaps the most important narrative that she discusses is the narrative of the fight. This is a story in which a man is physically confronted by another man and overcomes him, getting something that the other man hoped to stop him from getting. This serves to maintain a dominant version of masculinity in that it displays autonomy, physical strength, and the subordination of another man. Leonard attempts to instigate his own version of the fight in Season 1, Episode 6 of The Big Bang Theory, when he attends a Halloween party with Sheldon and sees Penny's new boyfriend, a large, towering, muscular man dressed as a caveman. Dressed as a hobbit, Leonard couldn't be more subordinated by this man. Of course, when he does confront him, he fails miserably at performing a legible version of masculinity, creating a space in which the larger man can subordinate him physically and verbally. However, when Penny arrives back to the party after this fight happens, she sees the larger man holding Leonard in the air and demands that he set Leonard down and apologize. But it's important to remember what actually happened here. Leonard confronted this man with the intention to assert his dominance face-to-face and subordinate another man to his social status. Crucially, in the final scene of this episode, Penny is broken up with her boyfriend, and she seeks solace with Leonard. Eventually, she tells him that she wishes every man were more like him. Ironically, Leonard performed a more ignorant and problematic form of hegemonic masculinity than the case in this scene. If hegemonic masculinity subordinates the interests of others, notably women and gay men, then a performance of similarly hegemonic heterosexuality must also be a feature of hegemonic masculinity, and it follows that this performance also has a set of expectations and behaviors. Displays of heterosexuality parallel displays of hegemonic masculinity in several ways, especially with respect to achievement and cross-gender dominance. Scott Kiesling's analysis of heterosexual performance of frat boys in homosocial environments, and he establishes several patterns of expressing this heterosexuality. Kiesling's frat boys communicate their heterosexuality in a weekly process of gabble. It's a Sunday night ritual at which they recount stories of their weekend. These stories fall into two main groups. They're drunk stories or fuck stories. Drunk stories are stories told about fraternity members who have embarrassed themselves under the influence of alcohol. This is a way to subordinate another man in a public forum, which is like the inverse of expressing achievement. However, fuck stories detail the sexual exploits of fraternity members. They're often very graphic and reduce women as objects for the enjoyment of men. These are especially emblematic of hegemonic masculinity in that they display three of its core tenets: heterosexuality, the subordination of women, and achievement. Of course, the men on the Big Bang Theory don't have a lot of sex, and therefore don't talk a lot about sexual interactions that they've had, but that doesn't stop them from expressing their heterosexuality. In fact, they're constantly objectifying, gawking at, or literally stalking women that they find attractive, and they express these behaviors to their friends in an attempt to seem more masculine than their counterparts. Howard places the most stock in this particular feature of the hegemony. In Season 1, Episode 4, he receives accolades for outstanding work in his field, and at a work party shortly thereafter, his friends remark upon the attractive young woman accompanying him, who is later revealed to be a prostitute. This woman makes it clear, however, that Howard has not paid to touch her, and so we know that his intentions aren't sexual, nor are they for his own pleasure in any way. He doesn't consider this woman a person at all, but instead as an accessory which can elevate his status in the eyes of his peers and offer upward mobility through the intra-gender hierarchy. The show frames this as something that we should feel bad for Howard about. He is the put-upon geek instead of the misogynistic, status-grabbing, hegemonic man that he actually is. At this point, it seems clear that achievement overlaps with expressions of heterosexuality and dominance over women. Throughout The Big Bang Theory, for example, the principal characters belittle Penny consistently with respect to their own achievements, either insisting that she wouldn't understand, or telling her to hold on, honey, men work. Furthermore, in Season 1, Episode 8, we meet Raj's parents for the first time. Upon hearing that Leonard and Sheldon live together, Raj's parents assume that they must be a gay couple, something which Leonard and Sheldon race quickly to correct. However, their insistence on their own heterosexuality doesn't stick for Raj's parents, which makes it seem like the show is suggesting that sufficiently subordinate forms of masculinity are indistinguishable from performances of homosexuality. William Leap writes an interesting treatment of hypermasculinity in GSC, or gay sexual cinema, gay porn. What is somewhat surprising is that representations of typical hegemonic hypermasculinity show up even in cinema for gay audiences, and in fact, these performances are well received. Something which is key to understanding this phenomenon is the difference between subordination and separation, or rather that subordination doesn't necessarily beget separation. So in this way, hegemonic masculinity does not separate homosexual varieties of masculinity from the intra-gender hierarchy, but it does subordinate them in it. This is perhaps why we see the men on The Big Bang Theory so afraid of seeming gay. They view it as one of the few ways in which they could be further subordinated in the hierarchy. Of course, the hegemonic man doesn't actually exist, but it operates as an ideal which is constructed, reconstructed, and reified within the media and within the performances of cis-straight men themselves. The relationship between the features of hegemonic masculinity and masculine identity only exist in the process of their construction in media and gender performance. This is to say that the material physical world is understood and experienced through language, and therefore individual conceptions of maleness are informed by the language that is used to describe it. In this way, when the media associates a behavior or attribute with masculinity through construction, subversion, etc., it shapes the audience's conception of masculinity. Similarly, masculine performances which defy the hegemony are legibly subordinate, and thus are not legibly masculine, creating a space in which problematic performances of hegemonic masculinity go fully unnoticed.
by these subordinated men feeling, having this dominance, what, I guess, the role in society overall could you attribute to, like in terms of feminism, or being feminist, giving these subordinated men this like ability to come across as more masculine, is that a good thing? Or do you think the show is trying to portray it as like subordinated men deserve to maybe feel this way?
I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a problem and kind of a dangerous thing, in that the show sort of continuously frames it as like, you can't blame them for doing what they do because they exist in this ideology. When in reality, the things that they're doing are damaging and hurtful to people, and totally unsustainable in a good faith society. And so I think the important thing about this is just learning how to identify these more obscure forms of misogyny and homophobia as they serve some larger ideology of masculinity, and to try to weed them out slowly over time.
All right, thank you. Oh wait, Joey, there's